In the dim, temperature-controlled quiet of the Langley archives, George H.W. Bush paused before a metal shelf he hadn't seen in years. A thin, unmarked index folder rested alone, its tab empty, its edges slightly warped. The room felt colder as he reached for it, because nothing in CIA storage was ever left without a name. Bush didn't open the folder immediately. Instead, he held it by the edges, feeling the stiffness of paper that had not been touched for decades. The archive room hummed with the low, constant vibration of ventilation units, a sound that always reminded him how the CIA preserved silence as carefully as it preserved information. He stepped back from the shelf and placed the folder on the metal table under the lone overhead lamp. The light carved a clean rectangle across its surface, framing it like evidence waiting for interpretation. He glanced toward the glass window that looked out into the corridor. No movement. This section of the archives had been cleared hours earlier. The building was nearly empty at this hour, and the staff on rotation rarely walked past storage rooms unless summoned. Still, Bush felt the old reflexes returning, the instinct to verify, to listen for what wasn't obvious. He opened the folder slowly. Inside, there were no documents, no typed pages, no classification stamps, only a thin card, almost like an index placeholder. Its surface carried a faint indentation, as if something had once been clipped there, then removed with deliberate care. The absence itself felt like a message. Bush leaned closer. At the bottom corner of the card, nearly invisible under normal light, a faint pencil mark curved like a half-erased initial. Not a letter, not fully, just the suggestion of one. A trace someone had tried to eliminate, but not completely. Bush lifted the card toward the lamp, tilting it until the faint pencil curve caught the light. It wasn't recent. The graphite had softened, settling into the fibers of the cardstock the way only old marks did. Someone had written here long before the archivists standardized their filing system. That, more than anything, made the card feel out of place. He slid the card back onto the table and examined the empty folder again. Its interior showed the faint ghost lines left by documents that had once pressed against it, the slight discoloration where paper edges had rested for years. Whatever had been inside wasn't removed yesterday. This was older, much older, and yet the folder had been positioned on a shelf he knew had been reorganized during his directorship, which meant someone had returned it afterward. He stepped back and let his eyes adjust to the dim, even lighting of the room. The archives were arranged with clinical precision, but this single folder broke the pattern. Bush traced the shelf label with his finger. The sequence belonged to debriefing summaries from personnel rotations in the late 1970s. Not operational files, not intelligence assessments, just routine workforce documentation. Nothing remarkable, nothing sensitive. So why hide something here? A soft clink echoed from deeper in the archive, metal shifting against metal. Bush straightened. The sound was small, almost accidental, yet unmistakable in a room that rarely heard anything but its own machinery. He turned his head slowly, scanning between the tall shelves. No footsteps, no voices, just that lingering sense that something or someone had moved where they shouldn't. He rested a hand on the folder, anchoring himself in the stillness. Whatever this was, it hadn't been left to be ignored. Bush waited a few seconds, letting the quiet settle again. The metallic echo had been faint, but it carried that unmistakable quality of an object disturbed, a drawer, a cart, a latch. He moved slowly down the narrow aisle between the shelves, each step cushioned by the industrial carpet, yet sounding louder than it should. The air smelled faintly of dust and cold metal, the thought of decades preserved. Halfway down the row, he stopped. One of the rolling archive ladders stood slightly off its usual angle. Archivists aligned them habitually. They were never left skewed. Bush ran his thumb along the cold railing. A smudge, maybe from a hand, maybe nothing at all, dragged across the surface. He glanced upward. The top shelves held old microfilm containers, their labels too faded to read from below. Nothing else seemed out of place. He pressed the ladder gently. It rocked with the weight distribution of something that had been moved recently. Someone had climbed it, or stepped off it, not long ago. But why here? Why this modest corner of the archive instead of the restricted sections? Returning to the table, Bush looked again at the empty folder as if it might offer a different answer after his brief search. The card inside had shifted slightly, its faint pencil mark now angled toward him like a question waiting for acknowledgement. He exhaled slowly. The CIA taught vigilance, but it also taught restraint. Not every anomaly meant danger, but every anomaly demanded attention. Bush took a final look around the silent room. Rows of files stood like motionless sentries, their order undisturbed, except for the one folder placed where it did not belong. He closed the folder carefully, holding it against his chest, its weight insignificant, but its presence undeniable. If someone had left a message, it was quiet and intentional. Bush exited the aisle and approached the small monitoring desk near the archive's entrance. During his tenure, the station was always manned, even during late operations, but tonight the chair sat empty. A half-finished cup of coffee rested on a napkin, still releasing the faintest trace of warmth. Whoever had been here hadn't left long ago. He touched the ceramic edge, warm, not hot. A departure within minutes. The desk lamp illuminated a thin stack of check-in logs. He flipped through the pages carefully, names, badge numbers, timestamps. The last entry was from an archivist. He vaguely remembered, a quiet man with a methodical demeanor, but there was no sign out beside his name. The line simply ended, as if the routine had been interrupted. Bush set the log aside and looked at the small security monitor mounted above the desk. The screen, divided into grainy quadrants, showed different sections of the lower-level archives. Most frames were still, but in the second quadrant, a rolling cart stood in the middle of an aisle, positioned at a slight angle, as though someone had abandoned it mid-task. He knew that aisle, it belonged to outdated personnel evaluation materials, a part of the archive few bothered with anymore. A subtle instinctive tension settled in his shoulders. He lifted the folder again. The unmarked tab caught the glow of the desk lamp, its blank space almost confrontational in its emptiness. Whatever had been removed, whatever trace had been left behind, it had drawn someone back here tonight. Not for the file itself, but for the absence it represented. Bush glanced once more at the empty chair, the warm cup, the unfinished log. Someone had entered this room with a purpose, and someone had left in a hurry. Bush stepped away from the monitor, letting the silence settle as he studied the abandoned cart on the screen. The aisle it occupied was 2 rows over, not far from where he had heard the metallic shift. Whoever left it hadn't taken the time to push it back to its station. That alone suggested urgency or caution. He walked back into the maze of shelves, following the soft hum of the building's circulation system as a guide. The deeper he went, the colder the air felt, as if the temperature dipped slightly between sections. The agency always kept the archives cool, but there were pockets in the lower levels where the chill felt sharper, almost deliberate. Reaching the aisle shown on the monitor, Bush paused at the corner. The cart was exactly where it appeared on the screen, angled, half-loaded with unsorted folders, and positioned as though someone had stepped away mid-motion. He approached slowly, examining the top folder, personnel summaries from 1978, routine, bureaucratic, harmless. He sifted through the stack. Nothing unusual, no missing tabs, no altered labels, no markings to suggest sensitive material. Whoever came here hadn't been searching these files. Then he noticed it, a small crease along the carpet, just beside the cart's wheel, a subtle depression, as if a shoe had pivoted sharply. Someone had stood here, paused, turned, reconsidered, then changed direction. Bush looked up. The crease pointed toward a narrow side corridor that led to a rarely used microfilm room. It wasn't restricted, but it wasn't part of normal circulation either. People passed through when they needed solitude, not oversight. He scanned the empty hallway. No lights, no movement, just the faint echo of the ventilation running beneath everything. If the unknown visitor had come looking for something tied to that unmarked folder, this was the direction they would have gone. Bush tightened his grip on the folder and stepped toward the corridor, each footfall quiet, measured, and deliberate. The side corridor narrowed quickly. its walls lined with metal cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. Bush walked slowly, listening for anything beyond the faint hum of the building. The carpet here was older, thinner, and his footsteps pressed deeper into it. Halfway down, he stopped. The air smelled different, a faint trace of something displaced, like dust recently disturbed. Ahead, the microfilm room door stood slightly ajar. It was unusual. Archivists ensured every door in the lower levels was either fully open or fully closed for climate control. A door left in between suggested someone slipped through without wanting attention. Bush nudged it with 2 fingers. The hinges offered no resistance, swinging silently inward. The room was small, lined wall to wall with narrow drawers housing reels from a pre-digital era. A single desk lamp glowed in the corner, its switch still warm when Bush brushed it lightly. It had been turned on not long ago. He scanned the desk. No papers, no gloves, no sign-in slip. But the chair had been pushed away at an angle, as though someone had left quickly after noticing something or someone coming. Bush approached the central cabinet. One drawer stood open by an inch, just enough to catch the eye. He pulled it wider. The reels inside were neatly arranged, all labeled except for one gap near the center. A reel had been removed, and recently, the dust pattern on the metal rails hadn't settled yet. He checked the desk surface again. A faint smear of graphite arced across the edge, a match to the faint pencil mark inside the unmarked folder. Whoever was here had handled both. He closed the drawer softly. Someone was searching the archives for the same absence he had found, and they were a step ahead. Bush straightened, listening again to the hallway outside. Nothing, only stillness. But the room felt watched, not empty. He held the folder tighter. The message was becoming clearer, even if the trail remained invisible. Bush stepped back into the hallway, letting the microfilm room's stale air drift behind him. The corridor was still empty, but the quiet felt heavier now, as if the building itself held its breath. He moved slowly, watching for the smallest disturbance, a shifted draft, a shadow cutting the dim glow of overhead lights, anything that might betray someone's recent passage. Near the end of the corridor, he paused. A single sheet of archival tissue paper lay flattened against the wall, its corner caught under the baseboard. He pulled it free. It bore no writing, no stamp, no residue, but the edge was freshly creased, suggesting it had slipped from someone's hand or pocket while they moved through the archives. He folded it once and placed it inside the unmarked folder. Ahead, the hallway opened into a larger junction, one path looping back toward the main archive floor, the other descending a short ramp to a secure storage annex. Bush knew the annex well. It housed older consolidation files, items too sensitive to destroy, too irrelevant to keep active, and too ambiguous to categorize cleanly. A perfect place for something or someone to disappear into. He approached the ramp but stopped when he noticed a faint reflection on the polished metal handrail. A thumbprint, just a smudge, but fresh enough to reflect the overhead light. Someone had steadied themselves here recently, likely moving quickly. Bush glanced down toward the annex door, closed, locked by default. But the keypad's green indicator light glowed faintly. Active, not dormant. Someone had keyed in a code within the last few minutes. He took one step closer, his movements deliberate. The quiet pressed tighter around him, amplifying the distant vibration of machinery deeper in the compound. He rested his fingers lightly against the folder, grounding himself in its inexplicable emptiness. Whatever had been removed, whatever had driven someone back into these archives tonight, it wasn't random. It was connected, and the trail was leading him directly toward the annex door. Bush stood before the annex door, listening to the muted hum of the building beneath the silence. The keypad's green glow felt almost intrusive in the dim corridor, a quiet confirmation that someone had breached the room recently. He pressed the handle, locked. Of course, the annex always re-engaged automatically, but the warmth lingering on the metal surprised him. Someone had passed through no more than a few minutes earlier. He entered his old clearance code, uncertain whether it would still hold authority. The keypad accepted it with a soft click. The door eased open, releasing a thin draft of colder air, the kind preserved for aging documents and materials too sensitive to leave in standard storage. Inside, the annex was darker than the main archive, lit only by narrow ceiling strips that cast long, sharp shadows across the aisles. The shelves here were different, fewer labels, more sealed boxes, many with blacked-out inventory tags. Bush moved forward slowly, his footsteps almost soundless on the reinforced flooring. Halfway down the first row, he stopped. A box sat slightly pulled out from the shelf, its lid pressed down but not fully aligned. He touched its edge, warm like the door handle. He slid it open. Inside were redacted brief notes from a mid-70s administrative review, routine and unremarkable. Nothing connected to the unmarked folder, but beneath the top layer of documents, a single sheet lay off-center, as though placed in haste. Bush lifted it. It was blank, not faded, not erased, simply unused archival paper, the same stock as the card inside the folder he carried. A pattern was forming, but it was built from absences, not traces. As he set the paper back, something shifted 2 aisles over, a soft, quick movement, too light to be a falling object. Bush straightened, every sense sharpening. Someone else was still inside the annex, and they hadn't expected him to follow this far. Bush held his breath, letting the annex's stillness settle around him. The faint movement he'd heard could have been a whisper of air, a shifting shelf, anything harmless, but instinct told him otherwise. He stepped carefully toward the end of the row, pausing before turning the corner. Only the steady hum of the climate system greeted him, its cold rhythm filling the shadows. He glanced down at the folder in his hand, the unmarked tab, the empty interior, the faint pencil curve. Each detail formed a puzzle built not from evidence, but from what was missing. Someone had left this trail intentionally, and someone else had followed it with urgency. Bush backed slowly from the annex, closing the door with a quiet click behind him. Whatever was occurring in these archives tonight wasn't meant to be uncovered all at once. Some messages arrived in pieces, delivered through silence rather than words. As he walked up the ramp and the echo of his footsteps faded, the folder pressed lightly against his side, weightless yet impossible to ignore. Some absences, he knew, carried more meaning than any file ever could.